Writing a solid, good recipe depends on knowing your audience well. But in today's fluid era of communication, how do you gauge people's ever-changing needs and interests so that you can craft a long-term, productive career? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Andrea and I'm with Kristin Donnelly today. We're going to talk about how to define target audiences on just not one country's turf, but two countries' turf. Hey, Kristin, how are you?
Hey, Andrea, doing well.
So when you plan and write a cookbook, how do you figure out who you're writing for?
I've only done one real full-size cookbook that is my own book, and everything else has been for other people. And in the case of my own cookbook, Modern Potluck, it was an extension of myself. So it was like I had this problem. I love to cook. I had a new baby. I couldn't, figure out how to cook for people anymore. So I was like, oh, potlucks. This is a solution. I created a book of recipes that were great for gathering, that were a little bit impressive, but you get to make one dish and get this whole meal in return. So in that case, there was that. And then when I work with other people, I'm sort of getting into who their audiences are. So it shifts a little bit. But how about you?
I think about what I'm interested in. I think about what may interest other people in terms of the progression of my work. But with Evergreen Vietnamese, that's the first time when I reached out to folks and took a poll of my online community to see, what they were interested in and if their interests in plant-led, plant-driven, plant-based cooking align with mine, which is, low meat flexitarian. And so I use that as a way to center my recipes in Evergreen Vietnamese, but each one of us has a different approach. And today I'm so looking forward to an expert who can help us out with that. And that is Hetty McKinnon. If you don't know Hetty McKinnon, she is a prolific author and recipe developer whose work spans the Pacific. Her weeknight-friendly recipes have filled 5 cookbooks and countless recipe URLs on the New York Times' Yogurnaut cooking portal. She's well known in Australia, where she was born and raised. She helms Peddler, a multicultural food journal. Hetty also publishes a Substack newsletter titled To Vegetables with Love. Hello, Hetty. How are you?
I'm very well. Hi, Andrea. Thanks for having me. And hi, Kristin.
Hi, Hetty.
It's a real thrill to be here.
Well, Hetty, you've had such a varied career in food. Tell us about Arthur Street Kitchen and how you switched from cooking to writing cookbooks.
Great question to start with, Andrea. Everything I'm doing in food right now is really an accident. This wasn't some grand plan to be working in food. I never had a food dream, as many people do. But in 2011, I decided after a career in PR and after having 3 children in quick succession that I wanted to have a change of pace. And I was living in this really beautiful community in Sydney and I had great friends in the area. And I decided I really wanted to do something just to cook for the community and something that would keep me rooted there. I didn't want to go back to an office and do that. So I basically, with no business plan, just with an idea to nourish people with good vegetarian salads, and with no background in cooking or salads at all, really, other than liking to eat them, I started kind of coming up with vegetarian salads, putting them in boxes and cycling them around my neighborhood. People loved it. It was a huge transformational time for me because I was learning a lot about cooking, learning a lot about flavors, but also learning a lot about the power of food to connect people, to bring people together. I made great friends in that community through, over the exchange of a salad box. It was really very powerful project for me. So I did that for about 4 years and it was amazing. I learned to cook through Arthur Street Kitchen. And then kind of halfway through that time, customers were asking me to share some of the recipes and I'd never written recipes before. So I kind of taught myself to record the food that I was cooking for them. And then I would just email it out to them, share it that way. And then there was one week I remember when 3 different customers said to me, you should write a cookbook. So I did. And I went home and I started writing them down. And because that process was learning, that project was all about learning how to cook for me. Every week it was new salads. So I had a lot of salad kind of recipes up my sleeve. I spent about maybe a year writing them down and then we shot it with a friend and I self-published that book. It's called Community. And I really self-published it really thinking it would only be sold to the people, my customers. But being a paper geek and one of my early jobs in PR was working in print production. We did a lot of print production at the PR agency. So I knew the language of printing. I knew the language of paper. So I went to a printer and they said, 1,000 copies is really your minimum for a good price. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. We cleared, thinking that I would have these books forever, as many self-publishing vanity projects, end up in having books for the rest of your life. But we cleared all this, cleared our furniture in our living room and, ready for the boxes. And they were delivered and my customers lapped it up. They loved it. They bought them. But, I wasn't a big business. I didn't have that many customers. But strangely enough, I set up a website. I was selling it on something called Big Cartel. This is showing how it's big. I don't even think Big Cartel is around anymore, but I was selling them online. They were being sent all across Australia and the world. People in like London bought it and New York. And I don't know how, because I wasn't even really on Instagram back then, but people heard about it. And the first print run of 1,000 copies sold out in 3 weeks, which was like, oh, that's pretty amazing. I had about 250 orders I hadn't filled yet. So I thought, oh God, I have to reprint. And I didn't want to do that because it's a lot of work, sending out your own books. And then really the day that I was about to say to my printer, I have to reprint more, I got a phone call out of the blue from a lady called Mary Small who worked at Pam Macmillan. I didn't know her at all, but she had seen the book at a friend's house. And the friend wasn't a customer, but he shared an office with a customer. So he had taken the book home and she happened to be an old friend of his and saw the book at his house. And she went and took the book to Pam Macmillan in Australia and basically sold the concept. They wanted the book. And by the time she called me, it was a done deal. Like they already had worked everything out from their end and they were like, are you interested? So that was really kind of how I transitioned from the cooking to the publishing. So it's all it feels very serendipitous. Everything that's happened to me in my food career has felt like just almost being, doing the right thing at the right time and taking the right opportunities as they came to me. Yeah. I continued to cook as I said, I released that book, Community, the first self-published edition in 2013. And then actually the Pam Macmillan copy then came out a year later, so 2014. And then that's the same year I left Australia. So I kind of left Australia with this very new book. But Community has been an amazing experience because it's a book that is done and has been received in exactly the spirit that it was written. And what I mean by that is that it is almost like the people's book in Australia. Like I've had to do very little promotion for it. People love and know that book all across Australia, in the cities, in the country, in regional areas. People from very different backgrounds find points of resonance and connection in that book. It's been a really amazing experience to witness. That book has been probably in Australia still my most successful book. It's so beloved that I actually did a 5th anniversary edition in 2019. I added stories of people who cook from the book. I added 20 new recipes. So it got a little bit bigger. And it's actually never been released anywhere outside of Australia.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, I've bought it here, but I guess it's
available here.
It's an Australian.
It's an Australian edition.
Yeah. I mean, it's pure like word of mouth and
Yes, it was
wow.
pure word of mouth and people just buying it for their family and friends, people loving it. I mean, it's all salads, all vegetarian salads, big, hearty, like roasted vegetables from various different multicultural backgrounds. And it really kind of encapsulates, I think, Australian food and that spirit of Australian food, which is very fresh based and people love gathering and barbecues and that type of thing. So, but it was amazing. I mean, it really wasn't, there was no social media involved. It was really people taking it under their wing and say, we love this book and we're going to share it with everyone I can. I've seen families who have WhatsApp groups dedicated to that book. I think in the recent years, it's been dedicated to like my recipes, but initially it was all about people cooking from that book and sharing photos of what they've cooked. And yeah, it's a really amazing. And I love the fact that there was no social media really. In the early days, it was just people loving to cook and loving to share that idea of, sharing food and seeing what other people had cooked and feeling connection from it, I think.
What's striking is what you just said, Hetty, about how that book captures the multicultural spirit of Australia. Here in the United States, like coming at it, an author would first like be writing about their DNA, their cultural heritage, more than just like, here's a book of salads that, resonates with the culture of our nation.
Yeah.
So there is something very distinctive about the Australian sensibility about food. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It is very different. And I've thought about this a lot. And I think that when people, I don't want to jump the gun, but I think that in the US, people really understood me after To Asia with Love was released because suddenly all the dots were connected. Before that, it was, why is this Chinese Australian woman that lives in America making salads? Like, why is she, like, it almost didn't make sense for a lot of people. In Australia, that story always made sense because, yes, I'm Australian, but like I didn't have any profile there before I released Community. But what it did is it just captured the flavors of a nation. It's a very young country. We have people from all over Europe. There's very, large Greek population, large Italian, Maltese, Chinese, obviously, Southeast Asian, Malaysian, Singaporean. There's big communities that have established themselves in Australia and made it their home. And so the way Australian food is, like, often you will go to a restaurant and it's categorized as modern Australian, but in that category and on that plate, you'll see Asian flavors, and that's clearly because of proximity. We are so close to Asia that it is almost a part of the DNA of Australian food. Like a curry laksa, for example, is as Australian as I think a meat pie. It is something that you can buy at every food court, in Australia, every shopping centre food court. I eat it at the airport. It is just a very, it's a very beloved dish. So, yeah, I do think that I have always, and I think that really runs through all of my recipes, really, is that kind of very free, multicultural approach to food. Yes, I cook Asian food. Yes, I cook Chinese food because I'm Chinese, but I also cook a lot of other things. And I kind of bring everything together in a way that it feels very natural to me. Like I don't feel like I'm forcing flavors to come together. It feels like very much of the food that I'm cooking is a reflection of my identity. And that identity is evolving, obviously. It's an evolving identity as the more years I live in America, it makes me delve deeper into all aspects of my own identity and how that relates to where I am now and where I live now and being away from, home or the place where I grew up. And that all plays into almost everything that I put on the plate, if that makes sense.
Yeah. This book was released. It's this sensation. And then you moved to the US, to Brooklyn, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
But you continue doing books.
Yes.
How did that work with neighborhood and family? Were those were led by the Australian publisher?
Yes. Well, Neighbourhood was. So I already had the deal before I left Australia to write a second cookbook. And I was literally like, I still remember, I can picture myself now. I'm standing outside my house. There's boxes being put into a cargo to be shipped to New York. And I'm on a call with my publisher in Australia. She's like, do you want to do a second book? I really want you to do a second book. And I'm like, I will do the second book, but I don't know what that book is going to be until I land in New York, in Brooklyn, and I have an idea. But I knew I wanted it to be called Neighbourhood. Like I had the name already, but in terms of like the story of that book, I didn't really know what that was because we also traveled for a couple of months before we landed in Brooklyn. So, but once I arrived in Brooklyn, I had a really clear idea of what I wanted to write about. It was always going to be a second book of salads, but Neighbourhood is more about kind of encapsulating a global approach to salads and really surrendering to your surroundings and seeing how the ingredients you have around you, how the influences around you affect the way you cook. And that's something that really came to me as we were traveling through Europe, and we spent a lot of time in France. We were almost there for a month and just kind of shopping from the markets and just cooking what was there rather than, we didn't have like access to a lot of the ingredients that I would have back home in Sydney. So it was really just cooking with what was available to me. Yeah, so that book was really led by the Australian publisher, and then it subsequently got published in the US. And that's kind of the way the rest of the books have worked, actually. They've all originated in Australia. And that's because in Australia, they have a very robust cookbook market. I don't know how to explain how different it is. There would be some authors that release 5 books a year.
Wow.
And
you release books every 2 or 3 years, right? Or every 2 years?
Yeah, so I'm on like a 2-year cycle with my publisher in Australia. So and in America, that's a lot. Like people say, whoa, that's a lot of cookbooks. And so I've kept with that 2-year schedule. I don't know if I will moving forward. I don't know if I need a bit more time, but that's been why the books are released almost, to the day every 2 years. It's been great. I mean, there's a rhythm to the way I do the cookbooks, but also with the cookbooks, they're really like my happy space. Like if people say, who are you? Like, what do you do? What's your job? I would say cookbook author, because there's never a time when I'm not working on a cookbook in some capacity, whether that's developing or writing or shooting or then editing, promoting. I don't think I can remember a time for the last 10 years when I haven't been working on a cookbook. I mean, out of all the things that I do, it's what I love the most. It is what I think is the truest reflection of who I am as a person. And it's also the form of the work that I do, which allows me to evolve as a recipe developer. Like in books, it's a world that allows me to kind of develop my style, and as I say, it constantly changes, and I love that. I love seeing that you don't stay the same person as you were. You don't stay the same recipe writer or cookbook author as you were 10 years ago. You evolve, and you keep kind of pushing boundaries and seeing how far you can take it. And I'm sure you both can relate to that.
Yeah. I have to ask, what brought you to the United States?
It was nothing that exciting, to be honest. My husband got offered a transfer, and it was like a very weird time for me to want to leave Australia. But after the book was released, I started getting a lot of attention, and people wanted to order food from my salad business, and it got a bit much. Like I never wanted it to be a big business. I didn't have any dreams to really have brick and mortar in the traditional sense. Like I wanted to do a community kitchen, which I actually did do in Brooklyn for a little while before COVID, but I didn't really want to run like a salad shop. And I felt like that was where the pressure was. And so I thought, oh, okay, like I don't know what to do here. I don't know how to manage these expectations. So when this idea of moving to New York came up, I kind of took it with 2 hands, and I thought, I can do this.
I can be a star over there. And
No, I really wanted anonymity, actually. I wanted to go back to being just nobody and cooking salads again, because there's really there's magic in that model where people love you because of your food and nothing else, because of purely like you've touched something in them with your flavors and with the message in that salad box. It was so magical. I don't think it can ever be recreated because the world is a different place. But I did try and do the salad deliveries in Brooklyn for a little while. I did it for about 6 months. It was really hard because I couldn't cook from home. And in Sydney, I could. You can register to cook from home there, but couldn't do it in New York. So I used a commercial kitchen and I would be dragging stuff back and forth on the subway. And it's a true New York story. And it wasn't that enjoyable. So I kind of I let that go. And, over the years, I love cooking for people. I mean, it's just to cook, but then to actually see the joy that brings to people. It's like a very different experience than writing recipes, for example. So I really missed that. But I did have a community kitchen in New York for a while, for about 3 years. And we held like kind of pop-up dinners and,
cool.
like kind of market days and things like that. But, running a business is also, you're paying exorbitant rent and, you got to rent it out to other people to be able to make your rent at the end of the month. So it's hard. I mean, I tried it and I would feel maybe something missing if I hadn't tried it, but I'm happy not to have that stress of a New York landlord and then just a New York kind of all the expenses involved in having a New York business. It's not easy. So, yeah.
Most definitely. So with books 4 and 5, To Asia with Love, that came out in the U.S. in 2021 and then Tender Heart in 2023, you switched to focusing or exploring more of and showcasing your Asian heritage.
Yeah.
More in the title. You come out right and you say, I'm Chinese Australian.
Yeah.
How does heritage inform your work and when does it not matter so much?
I think your identity as a cook, you can't separate that from who you were born as, the home that you grew up in. I mean, all the flavors and everything I really know about flavors and what I like to eat comes from my childhood home, from the food that my mother cooked. So that has always been, even when I was making salads in Sydney, that was always the backbone of how I put together flavor. I need big flavors. I need lots of texture. I'm Cantonese, so Cantonese food is very savory. And so I'm always looking for that. But there's been an Asian chapter in every single one of my books, including Community. And even though I didn't grow up eating salads, my mum played a fairly huge part in that business because she would be at my house and she'd be babysitting, and I'm saying that in inverted commas, but she would actually be like kind of telling me ingredients to use and seaweed. You should use seaweed. You should use lotus roots, a great salad ingredient. She'd be saying all these things and she doesn't know how to make salads really. So taking those Chinese ingredients that I grew up eating and combining them with sort of the other flavors and ingredients of Australia, that is kind of how I learned to cook kind of for other people. So I've really continued that throughout all of my books. However, I think after I did Family, which is a book about kind of cooking for your family, cooking vegetarian comfort food. And at the same time, I was really working on Peddler, which is my multicultural food journal, which is a very different speed to my books. It's all about small stories, memories, traditions, rituals from home. I think those two things together really influenced the way I saw myself and what I wanted to write about. It gave me confidence to really not confront, but maybe confront who I really am. And it gave me the courage to really dig deeper into those memories and into those not only flavor memories, but also just memories, and how a lot of my memories from childhood are around food. Almost all of them are around food. And perhaps these are the ones I've held on to, but I actually don't know if I really even realized how big a role food played in my childhood. And with my mum initially, because I feel like my mum because she's still around, she plays so much of a influence in the food that I've cooked, really, and in the way I've approached the recipes and the flavors. And then, in Tender Heart, it's a different, I've kind of looked at the role, the influence of my dad and his job as a banana monger and working at the markets and bringing that home to me. So, I think that in everything I do nowadays, because I live in New York, I live a long way away from my mum and where I grew up, there is a certain yearning that probably underlines a lot of the food that I create. And I say yearning because I almost think that if I lived in Australia, I wouldn't be as interested in exploring my identity. I wasn't when I lived in Australia, but living far away, it does make you have to recreate those flavors that you want. You have to dig deeper for the memories. You have to work harder to keep those memories alive because everything that anchors you is so far away. So I think that living in America has really brought out a different side of me and allowed me to just explore my identity more and see how that plays out on the plate, if that makes sense.
As a writer, it seems like you've evolved as well into telling these more personal stories. Has that been very conscious? How have you developed your writing voice?
I feel like I'm still developing it. It changes. It has, in terms of whether it was conscious, it wasn't. I think, as in any craft, you get better as the more you do, so the more you develop recipes, the better developer you become. The more you write about food, the better writer you become. And the more cookbooks you write, I hope, the better the cookbooks get. It's a craft. But I definitely do feel like having the confidence and the thought to think about my identity has given me the courage to become a better writer and just give myself leverage to just write and see what comes of it. I've always loved writing. I love the writing aspect of it. And, I studied communication, so writing is something that comes very naturally to me. But I'm always kind of trying to push those boundaries and to find new styles. I think that there's definitely in every book, there's a new tone. And to really kind of write in a way that feels very true to who I am. That's something that I have gotten better at as I've written more cookbooks, actually.
A lot of the recipes in Tender Heart they're one-page recipes. And to convey instruction and storytelling, that's hard to do. How do you gauge what the needs are for your audience?
I think mostly the needs of my audience is my own needs. I don't want to cook a long recipe. Most of the time, selfishly, I'm basically writing for myself. Like I'm writing recipes that I want to cook in my own kitchen. I do use a lot of my own recipes. I cook from my own books quite a lot.
Yay! As we should.
And when I'm absolutely stuck for what am I going to cook tonight, I do dig out my own books because they're familiar. And I think the recipes that I want to cook are ones that are very succinct, that don't have a lot of ingredients, that feel very approachable and use things that I already have in the kitchen and don't use a lot of pots and pans and trays and all sorts of things. And often I do use food processors and blenders, but if I don't have to, I will kind of eliminate in a way. I always say you can use that if you want, but I'm going to use a fork to mash this chickpea or whatever. But yeah, I think that there's only a couple of recipes in Tender Heart that run over one page. One page is really it's a goal. And in editing, it's definitely something we look at. My headers, particularly in Tender Heart, were very long. I love headnotes. And for me, a headnote is a soul of a cookbook because they are your opportunity as a recipe writer. I've noticing some people don't write headnotes, and I would just like to say, I'd like to say my piece on this because it's everything cookbooks.
Yes.
But I do think that the headnotes are the soul of a recipe. They are your chance to give your recipe perspective, to give your reason for writing it, to deliver history if there's history involved, to give it your interpretation and why you've interpreted it a certain way. It's so important. It really flavors your entire recipe. And without it, it just feels a little soulless. So I write a lot. Write a lot of head notes, and they're often very long. And for space, some of them, a couple of them in Tender Heart had to be cut a little bit, but with a very deep consultation with the publishers. But we do really try and keep them every recipe one page, and there's also a photo for every recipe, because that's just the format that I like personally, and it's the format that my Australian publisher likes too. So,
and you're taking your own photos now.
I am. So I have done that for the last 2 books. And I really also, again, I developed more confidence. I've always taken photos, but now I wouldn't ever see it or describe myself as a professional photographer. But I'm very comfortable around taking photos. I'm very comfortable around editing photos, and people ask me about taking photos for their own book. And I always say the hardest thing is actually file management. So I think a lot of people can take photos, but it's actually managing those files and making sure that they're in order, because those have to be passed directly to an art director. And if they don't make sense, everything can fall apart. You save yourself so much time by naming all your files correctly.
Yeah.
And putting them in proper folders right after you've taken the photo, or, after the bunch. I usually edit immediately and start, doing my filing on the computer. So that's my process. But yeah, in terms of taking my own photos, I think with To Asia with Love, I knew I wanted to do that. I knew that it was such a personal story. It was the story about, the food that I grew up with, and my mum's food, and the Asian food from Australia. So I really felt like I needed to express that story of those recipes myself. And I found that, through working on Peddler, I developed more confidence in doing that. So I felt a real creative need to take the photos for that. And subsequently for Tender Heart, I didn't really question that I would take the photos, but it has a very different look to Asia with Love. And I almost, as soon as I had the idea of the book, I could envision what every single page would look like. And it was so clear to me that there is really, I think for now, kind of moving forward, it's almost like I'm the best person to express how I want my books to look, because for me, they are such a full package. I'm very, very involved in every decision that goes into the book creatively, the colors that are used, the fonts that are used, what the end papers look like. It's a very close creative relationship. So yeah, just taking my own photos feels like the only way I could really do it now.
And are you shooting them sort of ongoing, 1 or 2 a day sort of thing? Or is it more like you set aside time and do these large photo shoots?
It's kind of ongoing. So it depends on what I'll cook something. I might take a photo if I'm not happy with it, and I'll go back and change the recipe. I'll take a new photo, but I'm kind of recording as I'm going. I don't do a big shoot, 2-week shoot or whatever. I just kind of record as I go. I have a lot of props. I have a very large prop inventory. They're not really props. They're just dishes that I have.
Sure.
But I have a lot of them, and they're all on display. They're easily accessible. I shoot everything in my house on surfaces, particularly in To Asia with Love. It was really very completely not styled. In Tender Heart, because I wanted every photo to be quite stark and to just focus on the dish, the actual food. It was, just kind of taken around the house where there was natural light. In that particular season, because it actually in my house, it changes depending on the season, depending whether there's leaves on the big tree outside. So it's really chasing the natural light around the house.
So when you're writing for your recipes, you have the Australian cook in mind first and foremost, or how do you know, what, because there are differences in ingredient names and measurements and cooking instructions.
Yep.
So how do you do that for works? Your works are being released in Australia first, and then in America, we go through this thing called Americanization of cookbook manuscripts. So what is your process like when you're writing for 2 countries?
I'm writing for both all the time. In my head, when I'm writing a recipe, I'm thinking, is this going to be available in Australia? Is this going to be available in America? And it is a constant, quite chaotic process in my head all the time. But actually, every single recipe I write, other than the stuff that you write, editorially for a US publication. But maybe it's also influenced by that too. But definitely for the books, I write them for both because I live here. The recipes are developed here with American ingredients. But I have enough knowledge about Australia to understand what is available there. For example, like macroot lime leaves are very, very available in Sydney, where I'm from. I won't speak for all of Australia, but you can buy it in every supermarket, everyday supermarkets. It's highly accessible. In America, less so. In New York, less so. There's only a couple of supermarkets that sell it. So often I will say, it's optional. You can put it in, or I'm very conscious of all those differences because I think I'm in quite a unique position where I know both markets really, really well. And I almost know exactly what ingredients are going to cause consternation in Australia. So for example, ramps, I'm never going to include a ramp recipe in any of my books because I know that it is not available in a lot of the world, aka Australia, where a lot of my audience is. But I think in a way, perhaps it makes me a better, more concise recipe developer that I'm always working with these kind of parameters. I kind of quite like working with parameters when I'm cooking.
Boundaries create better creative work.
Yeah, definitely.
Hetty, when we were in New York and met up a while back, you and I talked about that sheet pan-fried noodles recipe as like this viral recipe. And, it's one of the things that we've talked about on the podcast is like, how do you go about creating a viral recipe? Is that on intention or do you just like, when you're writing, you just like know? How did that recipe come about?
I never know, Andrea. I never know. I wish I did. I wish someone would tell me. There's often recipes I think, everyone's going to love this. This is going to go off. And it just doesn't. And I'm like, okay. Like I really don't know what goes viral. In terms of coming up with that recipe, it was very, very specific. Like now lots of people are making like noodles on sheet pans and that's great. But I think, when I did it, I don't know if there was other recipes around. But for me, I used a sheet pan because I wanted to create the very specific textural elements of my mum's chow mein, which is a Cantonese chow mein, which is not like the chow meins you get in a lot of Chinese American restaurants. It is a Hong Kong style. So it's very, very crisp on the base. So it's almost like she almost pan fries it like the noodles look like a patty in the end because it's completely crispy on the bottom. And then she'll transfer that to a plate and then she'll do like a stir fry kind of a wet, like almost like a gravy. And then she pours that over the top. So what that creates is this beautiful contrast in texture, slightly almost soggy on the top where the sauce has gone, and the sauce kind of runs down to the bottom. A little bit of the crispiness goes softer, but there's an inherent crispiness at the bottom. And in terms of like creating that actual sheet pan recipe, I can't really remember like how it came about, but I just one day wanted to try it and to see what came out of it. And what came out of it is this dish that was so close to what my mum created, but without any of like the kind of the fussiness of transferring noodles and like monitoring the heat. My mum's very good at monitoring heat of things and having it high and then turning it low. And for me, it's just like this much more free way of just using the sheet pan and high heat as your, that's basically what you're using to create. And then you're going to put this sauce over the top that creates that kind of softness in the noodles, that lovely contrast. I had no idea that recipe would be the one that everybody chose to fall in love with. But I think that what I've learned from that is like people want things that are super simple. And I think the other thing with a lot of the recipes in To Asia with Love that people really loved is the fact that it was giving them a dish that they were really familiar with. Like Americans are very familiar with Chinese food. So giving them a dish and flavors that they were familiar with, but giving them a really easy way of creating it themselves. And I think that instilled a sense of pride in a lot of home cooks that, look, what I could create. I've created a dish that feels like I've gone to the restaurant for. This is something that I never thought I could cook myself. And it's just so easy. Like none of the ingredients are anything that you even need to go to a Chinese or Asian grocery store for. They're all available from your local supermarket. So I think that's, the other element of what I try to do when I develop recipes is instill that confidence in the home cook and how am I going to do that? So the sheet pan is a great resource.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant because I've done the old school method in the skillet, and it is daunting. And that was a dish that you can't get done properly at a restaurant.
Yes,
it's home cooking.
Yeah.
It's home cooking and buying the right noodles and getting them just crispy, and soggy, just joggy enough.
Yeah.
And you can do that with supermarket ingredients. And people absolutely love the ability to create Asian flavors with readily available ingredients.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
You've been developing a lot for publications in the US, like the New York Times and Washington Post. So basically you're building your audience here. You have a big audience in Australia, but you're building it here. And I guess I'm just wondering how you've gone about that these past 10 years.
I haven't really thought about it. None of it's been deliberate, if that makes sense. It's been very organic. In terms of starting to work for publications over here, it was purely because I had a lot of recipes. You can't write 6 books at once. You can only ever write 1 book at once. And I've got more recipes than I have places to put them. And so really starting to work for publications was about kind of having a chance to develop recipes that are outside of what I would do for my own books, what I would do for myself. And so, I think I started working with some smaller publications when I was first here. And then I started working with BA and the New York Times, which has been actually working for the Times has been amazing in terms of making me a better recipe developer, in terms of thinking about what is absolutely crucial to this recipe, what steps are absolutely crucial, and then what things do you think that aren't important but actually are really important in terms of explaining. And I think that's what working for publications has given me. I think it does reflect in Tender Heart, my latest book, in To Asia with Love, probably. But in terms of audience building, it's all been very organic. I really don't go out of my way to win new audiences, because I've always believed that when you do really good work and when you put out really good recipes, your audience will come to you, they will find you. So I think that I used to always say I would rather sell more books than I have Instagram followers.
Sure.
Because
now
because the people that buy your books, they're real. They are people that have invested in you as a person and invested in your world, the world that you've created for them. And that's always been very important to me. I've always thought of actually, you say I've kind of built audience, but I always think of it as I'm a slow burn. Some of my recipes have gone viral. And of course, when you're on the Times, you are visible to more people. But even that is, you got to build your audience kind of slowly on that. People, when you're new there, people don't know your name. It's a different audience and they're cooking your recipes. And then they really like your recipes. I've had people say to me, so you meet someone and they say, oh, what do you do? Where are your recipes? And you say, the Times. They'll immediately get out their app and they go, oh my God, I have 10 of your recipes saved. I didn't even know you were the author. So it's one of those things that people kind of learn your style. They learn the way you cook. They like your recipes. I'm building a trust with every home cook. That's the way I've seen it. And it's a slow burn because I've been around, yes, but I'm not one of those TikTok sensations. I pride myself on building an audience based on really good recipes, on giving them recipes that they can rely on, that they can cook again and again and again for their families and their friends and their neighbors, giving them something that has touched them in a way. And I think that from what I've seen, and particularly because I've been on tour and I've been meeting people and talking to people, I think in the last 2 weeks, because I was on tour for Tender Heart, it really reminded me about the power of food to change someone's life, the power of food to touch someone. I think sometimes when you're just writing recipes, it can be easy to forget. But when people are saying to you, you changed my life with this recipe, or you saved me with this book, it's you realize
it's really something.
It's really something. I'm sure you've heard it too, Andrea. And it's you realize how important what we do is. And for that reason, I will never bend to trying to be any sort of sensation, that I will continue to do good work, put out great recipes, and keep building that trust with the audience that I think I've very slowly built over the last 10 years.
Yeah. You know, this would help listeners too. I mean, how did you get to a place where you were able to write for the Times or pitch to the Times or BA and stuff like that? Because, you know, people will be like, I want to be Hetty McKinnon. How can I be Hetty McKinnon? There is only one Hetty McKinnon, you know. But
oh gosh.
But do you have any advice for folks who want to build that trust?
Honestly, I just emailed them.
Nice.
It was not anything. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time in the early days, I did, you know, need to pitch. I can't really remember how BA came about, to be honest. But by that time, I'd already been in the States for, you know, a good 5 years. I'd been contributing in small parts. I mean, people knew about me. I'd had books out. I think when Family came out, I wasn't really even working for a lot of the publications. But, you know, there was a body of work where people could see what I was about, you know, what type of food I create, what sort of stories I tell. So I think for me, like, it was really like for the Times, for example, I think I sent an email and said, hey, would you be interested? And I may have been rejected once. I think I was rejected once, but I went back and they said, yes, we want you. And so it's always about like kind of, a lot of people kind of want to contribute to all these titles without doing work. So in terms of like, for me, and I don't want to sound like a parent in this, even though I am a parent to three teenagers, but you know, you have to work hard. You've got to prove yourself. And I think you prove yourself, and people might say, oh, but you could write cookbooks. And I was like, oh, yes, I was very lucky. Like I know that my career in cookbooks has been very fortuitous, and I've had opportunities that a lot of other people don't have. But you know, that could, for younger people, it could be like doing a Substack, like Andrea and I both have, and just showing people the work that you can do, showing people like what your style is with recipe development, for example. Because I think every person has a recipe development personality. There is no two people that would develop the same recipe the same. And so it's like constantly creating and showing people what you can produce in any avenue you can. And don't be afraid to reach out to people. And if you're rejected, go back again. And not everything gets picked up. I mean, I think that's really just, you know, showing people your recipe personality, if that's what they're interested in. Yeah, I mean, I don't pitch that much anymore, luckily. It just kind of, I'm in like kind of a sweet spot where I'm lucky I can do work for the publications that want to work with me, and I can work on books and my newsletter, my own stuff at the same time. So yeah, but it is about building a repertoire of work, I think.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, how are people to know like who you are as a recipe developer?
Yeah. Speaking of your newsletter and all this writing, the books every 2 years, which in the United States feels like a lot. How do you do it? I mean, yeah, you said you have more recipes than places to put them sometimes. So what does that creation process look like?
Yeah. So that varies. Like sometimes I do have a running list on my notes app, my most used app on my phone.
Same.
A running list of ideas of just combinations of foods, flavors, ingredients, things that I've thought about while I'm walking down the street or on the subway. Then there are sometimes, you know, I'll go to a restaurant and go, oh, wow, this is really an interesting application. What can I do to translate that into a dish that I would cook? That happens less now because I don't eat out as much. But also, you know, travel, like sometimes you go to a new city. That's always, you know, travel is like obviously something we've not done enough of. And it's also a great privilege to be able to travel. But I find that everywhere I go, like there is something that sparks. Just seeing people create food in different ways is a great inspiration for me. But yeah, I mean, it's very different. Like sometimes I'll just have an idea and I'll need to cook it straight away and see where that takes me. Often it will be an ingredient-led scenario where I'll have an ingredient and I'll say, and that's actually a lot of how, well, all of Tender Heart was developed really was taking one vegetable and go, what can I do with this vegetable with what I have in the pantry to make it super interesting and tasty and textural. And so I'm always kind of thinking about those elements. But like, it's really hard to put my finger on like where inspiration comes from. It just comes from everywhere. It comes from like, it's the sum of every person I've ever met, every meal I've ever eaten, every place I've ever traveled. It's just, I don't know. I can't explain it, but I do have a lot of ideas.
You do. I mean, it's overwhelming because Kristin and I were like, how does she produce so much content? You know, it flows out of you. And do you write them down in a notebook in addition to your notes app? Or do you, speak into the phone? How are you as efficient as you are?
So in terms of like actual cooking, most of the time I'll use my notes app. Like I will be cooking in the kitchen and I'll be writing it down in my notes app. There was a phase when I was using a notebook, but I found that to be quite onerous because I would then have to go and retype everything. And the great thing about the notes app, it's already there. And then obviously it's messy when I'm cooking. So I'll go back and like fix up I'll write basically in like weird shorthand, like I'll do SS and BP, like sea salt and black pepper and Evo for extra virgin olive oil. And so it'll be in like a shorthand that only I probably understand. That's really my process in recipe development at the moment. Like this week I've been cooking and I've actually often with a cookbook, I will write all the recipes actually conceptually. So I'll write them and then I'll bring the computer into the kitchen. And as I'm testing, I'll be taking notes. And that's often how I do cookbooks, actually. I don't know why I do cookbooks differently to regular recipe development, but yeah, it's like this different level of thought, perhaps, because you've thought about...
It's like seeing the whole package or something.
Yeah, it's almost like it's a story. So it's like, how does this recipe fit into my story? So it's almost like if I've written it out conceptually, like often I'll just write all the ingredients down and write like the vague instructions and then I'll go back. Because, after like 5 books and however many recipes I've written, I pretty much know if a recipe is going to work or not. Not always the dessert recipes because it's not my forte, but mostly my savory recipes make sense at concept level. And then it's just about adjusting the quantities of certain things to make it feel balanced. But yeah, that's another way I do it, is just really just writing the whole thing and then seeing where that takes me.
Cool.
The last question. So what is your work-life balance strategy? I mean, you mentioned the word balance. And so like, how do you, keep it together? Because right now I feel like there's so much going on in food media, and also just in the world. It's very stressful. And you have 3 teenagers. Yeah. How do you balance all of that?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. I work for myself. I love that autonomy of making decisions of, what's important, what can wait, what can't wait in terms of work, in terms of work having to slot into my family life. Because I'm also I'm very involved with my children's lives, probably too involved if you ask them. It is challenging, but in terms of cooking and recipe development, cooking for my family and recipe development, they're often the same thing. So I will develop a recipe and then we'll eat it for dinner, if it's good enough, because they're very discerning. But because I love what I do so much, the cooking never feels like, people say to me, oh, cooking is so hard. It is hard, but it's also like, if you love it, it's not hard to do on a daily basis. It's not hard to cook several things during a day if you really love that process. But, I work a lot, but most of the time, so this is something I realized recently, is that I've always been at home with the kids doing this food job. And I think they actually didn't realize I was working most of the time when they were younger, that they just assumed mum was off cooking again. They assumed it was for them or whatever. Most of the time it is for them because they do end up eating what I cook. So it is almost like blurred. My home life and my work life is almost blurred because it is so interrelated. So that's something that is for me, I feel lucky because it doesn't feel like, oh, and now I have to go to work and now I'm home. Like it kind of is almost the same thing in a way. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I work at very strange times. Like now I have a newsletter that goes out on a Sunday. So I find myself, I was like, why did I choose a Sunday? Because I was trying to be helpful to people thinking, hey, here's a recipe for Sunday night or Monday morning. You know, that's, you know, it's a nice way to start the week. But I don't know. I find it all, when you work for yourself, sometimes, you know, you do what you got to do. You know, I've got a really strong work ethic and it has to be done. So there's no point in complaining about it. It just is. So, yeah.
It really just is.
That's very Taoist of me, isn't it?
It is.
My
No,
mom is
it's also very Asian. That's what my mother says.
Yeah.
Just deal with it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hetty McKinnon.
Yeah, thank you, Hetty. This was wonderful.
Thank you. This has been a real joy and I'm really, really, really happy to talk to both of you today.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is also available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. Any book mentioned on the show can be found in our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thank you so much to our editor, Abby Circatella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.